have here is by Rosi Dagit. Rosi is the Senior Conservation Biologist with the Resource Conservation District of the Santa Monica Mountains, and she's going to talk to us about the Oak Woodland Conservation Management Plan for LA County that she played a very instrumental part in getting it implemented. Rosie's been involved in Oak Woodland issues, I know, for 20 years or more, and very active in a variety of mitigation plans and development plans, and just a wealth of information in Southern California Oak Woodland. So, Rosie, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thanks so much for being with us.
Well, thank you very much, Rick. Can you guys all hear me?
Yeah, Rosie, it's coming through great.
Okay, great. Well, Rick, thanks to all of you guys for putting this together, and I particularly want to thank Lauren because, boy, did he set the stage for me beautifully. So what I'd like to spend the next few minutes sharing with you is the information on how we as not planners, as concerned arborists, concerned consultants, county foresters, all the people who are not planners came together to try to figure out how to help move the planning process in a better direction in Los Angeles County. So this all started when in 2007, hold on here, yeah, there it is, in 2007, the Integrated Hardwood Range Management Program had an Oak Woodland workshop, and this was when Greg Gusti was presenting that Oak Decision Matrix and a bunch of other of these planning tools. And at that workshop, a number of us really decided that this was really helpful information, but it wasn't getting to the right people, and we wanted to figure out how we could do that and what we as individuals could do to move it from the ethereal, theoretical planning level to the on-the-ground planning level that Lauren was describing. So in 2008, a group of us got together. There were about 30 people who participated in this very regularly, and in fact, there were over almost 30 people who contributed some sort of written element to the Oak Woodland plan that we finally came up with. The RCD of the Santa Monica Mountains coordinated this effort, so my role was chief cat herder. And we did this basically with $50,000 because the LA County Board of Supervisors, Antonovich and Yaroslavsky, each gave us $25,000 to work with. And we had submitted a grant proposal to the Wildlife Conservation Board. But as you remember, in 2008, all the monies were frozen for the state government. And so we ended up just doing this as volunteers for the most part, which was a pretty amazing effort, actually. To give you a little context, Los Angeles County is a remarkable area. And along with the 13 million people, more or less, who live here, we have 17 species of oaks and 13 oak alliances. And the variety, and that's just the ones that show up in Keeler Wolf with oak as the start. But if you look at other assemblages, vegetation assemblages, there are oaks pretty much everywhere and very different kinds of oaks. So it's a very challenging place to try to legislate. One size does not ever fit all in this instance. And we know that oaks and human beings have had a long coexistence. And in fact, the historical record shows that Native Americans in Southern California, and in fact in many places in California, relied upon oak woodland resources for a tremendous amount of their ability to survive, not from food to medicine to shelter, all kinds of ways. So really one of the biggest challenges that we have as planners today, I think, is to remind people and to reconnect people with the natural world in which they live. I very often am told how lucky I am because I get to work in nature, and nature is always in capital letters with parentheses as a biologist. But in fact, the point I try to make to people is that we are all living in nature all the time. Wherever you are is part of the natural world. no matter how much we've built it and altered it. So we really need to reestablish those very tight connections with people. And as Lauren pointed out, there are a lot of problems when you just look at things from a single tree point of view. And LA County was one of the first counties in the state to enact an oak tree protection ordinance in 1982. But one of the big problems and frustrations that we've had with this ordinance is what it doesn't accomplish. And those important things that it doesn't address are what we really wanted to get at, where the meat at where we wanted to move the Oak Woodlands planning process. So Lauren mentioned the Oak Woodland Conservation Act of 2004, but the important thing about this is that it set up a process for voluntary conservation. And so we wanted to not only build on the whole idea that oak woodlands are now identified in the CEQA process as significant, but we also the individual landowners to understand and come on board with voluntary conservation. And one of the other problems that we would see is that every arborist or environmental consulting agency had a different way of identifying and treating oak woodlands when they evaluated them in the CEQA process. So one of our ideas was that if the county had a template for how people should do this evaluation of oak woodland resources and whether there were problems or not, we wanted to make that a little bit simpler and more transparent and more consistent. And finally, we wanted to also get on board with how do we look at the carbon sequestration issues. And the California Oak Foundation, Janet Cobb's group, has done a tremendous amount of work on this. And if you haven't looked at their website to see the changes 2040 that the evaluations they've done, I would recommend that you check that out. But what they're looking at is how do you evaluate the loss of carbon sequestration values when you convert an oak woodland. And the questions that they asked, I think, are very difficult to answer, and they're very challenging. But take us to a place where we're starting to look in tree time. And that was one of the biggest issues that I see in all my years of working with oak woodlands, is that we're working with people time, not tree time. It's a very different time scale. And last but not least, the ecosystem values of oaks are just not part of the discussion anywhere along the line, except for in a very cursory way. And how could we take that and make it a little bit more quantifiable so that people were really having to pay attention to these issues? So LA County is now one of the 16 counties in California to have an oak woodland conservation plan. And the reason we felt it really, really needed it was because of these huge challenges of the urban infrastructure that we're facing here. And we have this amazing opportunity because right this very moment, the Los Angeles County General Plan revision is occurring. So this is the oak woodland map that is currently in the LA County plan. And if you look, all the white spaces are developed area. On the upper portion, up in here, this is the Angeles National Forest. So these are areas that are already protected. Here are the Santa Monica Mountains, and then here we have the Puente Hills and Whittier Hills, just to give you a little orientation. But we really started with this question of what do we want our oak woodland resources to look like in 50 or 100 years? What kind of legacy do we want to leave to the future residents of Los Angeles County? And while this starts kind of in a big picture way, it really begins to help people reconnect with the idea that tree time and people time is different, and that if we don't plan now for what we want to see in 50 or 100 years, it for sure won't be there. And then this led to a bunch of other questions in the course of all of these people participating in this roundtable consensus-based effort to come up with a plan. So how do we do this? How do we make these conservation and protection decisions and balance this with the fact that we know that the population is growing and we need a lot of houses to do that? We need places for people to live. And what's the difference between protecting an oak tree versus an oak woodland? And one of the things that was really interesting with the group that we were working with is that it took quite a lot of effort for people to get their heads around the difference between what is a plan and what is an ordinance, because everyone had all these ideas of what they'd like to see on the ground, but we kind of had to take a step back and frame it in a planning perspective and a bigger picture policy perspective. And I'll get more into that in a second. But mostly what we wanted to come up with was a strategy that was clear, consistent, and fair so that people knew what they were getting into. And Tom Scott brought up the issue of certainty as a key piece of the puzzle for developers. And we really felt that that was a fair question and a fair issue for them to be worried about. And to have their project that they've been working on for 5 or 10 years be derailed at the last minute because of an oak activist group, that's kind of not the best way to go. What we'd rather do is have all these issues addressed up front. So as Lauren did, we went back and looked at the history of the distribution of oak woodlands in Los Angeles County, and it was fascinating to see what the patterns were. Very similar to Placer County, we found that by 1935, when Wieslander came in and did the mapping, he found pretty much the same picture that you saw in Placer County, in that much of the oak woodlands had been removed for fuel and firewood, had been cleared for a variety of different reasons, and the green patches that you see are the oak woodlands that are remaining. And this was in 1935. So the pattern that we see today is very similar to what we saw at that point. And if you look at the history of development in Los Angeles County, you can see that since the 1960s, it's just been exponentially huge. And that is continuing. And in particular, in the areas of the Santa Monica Mountains, in the Santa Clarita region, in the foothills of the San Gabriels, the same kind of pattern kept happening, where even though the existing general plan had a specific density projection, in fact, piecemeal alterations and variety of different wheeling and dealing allowed for a much greater density than what was originally anticipated. So after months of conversation back and forth, we decided to outline a number of specific goals. And I'm not going to read them all, but basically they come down to how do we get people reconnected? How do we develop incentives so that it pays you to preserve your oak woodlands rather than it pays you to clear them out? And how do we balance these needs for development with the need to protect our resources? Plan. This went back and forth and back and forth. And we tried to deal with a variety of different levels of benefits. And when it finally came down to how are we going to get everybody on board with this, it became really clear that we needed to divide the plan into 2 parts. And part 1 is the voluntary conservation strategy. This is the one that rewards you as a landowner for doing, quote unquote, the right thing with your oak woodlands. And it puts the county in a position where they can perhaps use the oak woodland, state oak woodland fund as matching funds to help augment or buy or get conservation easements on identified priority oak woodland parcels that are currently privately owned. This part was adopted by the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors in August of 2011. And like Lauren described, we really struggled with the definition of what is an oak woodland, because for every different kind of oak species, you can have a different kind of oak woodland. So we ended up defaulting back to the California Department of Fish and Game definition. And it was really interesting because we had a group of 150 planners, arborists, and foresters meeting at Descanso Gardens in 2009. And people were vehemently attached to a variety of different definitions. And this was the only one that we ultimately were able to obtain consensus on. And there were still a lot of people who were not particularly happy with it. But the key to that is, what is an oak stand? And so then you have to define what a stand is. And of course, stands definitions change based on trees and different tree species and tree assemblages. So yet again, we had this kind of wiggly thing that we had to deal with. So we ended up going back to the Fish and Game law again, 2 or more trees growing in a contiguous pattern. And so for the purposes of our plan, we identified the species, we identified the assemblages, and went to the 10% canopy cover that Lauren discussed as well. And further, we kind of used Greg's decision matrix that Adina mentioned earlier to give examples of what intact woodland, moderately degraded woodlands, severely degraded woodlands looked like, so that people could get a sense of where the woodlands that they were concerned about fell in the continuum. Moderately degraded woodlands seem to be the dominant pattern in Los Angeles County, and for many people, that's what their vision is of an intact woodland. So trying to give them that picture in their heads was a really important part of what we were trying to do as well. And one of the really interesting questions that we struggled with is whether or not you could take an individual tree, such as an enormous valley oak tree, and is that a woodland, even if the tree is 200 or 300 or 400 meters away from another individual valley oak. And so we set up this criteria of questions that you could use as a planner to determine whether or not this tree would, individual tree on a particular parcel might be considered part of an oak woodland. So today in Los Angeles County, we have about 133,000 acres. A third of that is private. And of those private acres, we have about 51,000 parcels. And so you can get a picture of how, unlike the Placer County example, where there was large continuous blocks, we're dealing with very, very small parcels, many of them well under an acre. And so one of the things that we identified as being a real problem is that individual property owners would often cut down any volunteer oaks that were growing on their property before they reached 8 inches in diameter, because once they hit 8 inches in diameter, they were protected by the LA County Oak Ordinance. And rather than deal with that, they would just cut the trees down. And what we wanted to do was to change that mindset, to make it so that oaks were a benefit and not a problem. And so one of the most interesting incentive ideas that came out of these workshops was that private homeowners and landowners could take the steps themselves to identify the oak woodland resource extent on their property and where they plan to expand it. And then perhaps if 10 years down the road they decided they wanted to put an addition on the house or move the driveway, the existing oak woodlands that they had nurtured for those 10 years would be considered as sort of pre-existing mitigation, if you will. So it was an interesting idea that we're still working on getting that implemented. But the most important thing that we spent a lot of time and energy on was calculating the value of oak woodlands. And I was really interested to see Adina's calculation earlier today, because basically it's the same thing we came up with. Only we added an ecosystem function value to the equation because we really felt that if for no other reason, it got people to think about these issues. So the use value is the actual value of the property that you've got the tree on, or the individual tree value based on the Council for Tree and Landscape Appraisal methods, which is a very commonly used arborist method. The non-use values are much harder to put a target on, and this is where Rick Standiford's research and others, where they have done a lot of willingness to pay kinds of assessments. This is the recreational, aesthetic opportunities, the value of being able to drive by an oak woodland, and how much that means to people in their day-to-day life. And finally, the ecosystem function values. There are many ways to calculate this depending on, a variety of different tools that are available online from the U.S. Forest Service, and also the carbon sequestration issues. But these are all benefits that the trees provide us for free all the time, every day. And as soon as we convert an oak woodland, now we, the community, have to pay for those resources, to pay for those services. So we're building stormwater conveyance systems and storm drains. We're dealing with water quality problems that we didn't have before. We have not as much groundwater recharge. We certainly have greater temperatures, and the air pollution reductions are not as good. So now we're paying for services that we've been receiving for free from the trees for years. So we wanted to get that on the table so that when the planning commissioners are looking at the cost-benefit analysis of does it make sense to allow this proposed development to go forward versus what it costs the county and the taxpayers in perpetuity, they can see the actual balance sheets. So those were all the kinds of things that we incorporated into the Part 1 voluntary piece of the plan. And then in Part 2, we dealt with many of the issues that Lauren already identified. And again, we were looking at how do we create incentives, how do we build certainty into the system, how do we become proactive in helping developers look at their parcels and their oak woodlands and plan in a way that emphasizes preservation and conservation rather than being reactive and just trying to do damage control. I'm not going to get into the landscape, the spatial scales, but as has been previously mentioned, it's really important that we pay attention to this on a variety of different levels, from the larger regional, eco-region kind of picture that Sasha talked about, to right down to the individual level of a tree in someone's backyard. And one of the key ideas is that we need to make trees and landscapes as much a part of the infrastructure in the planning process as possible, so that this is something that you look at right up front. It's not what you look at down the road after you've dealt with other infrastructure systems. This is a key and defining piece of the planning process. And how do we take those lessons and integrate this on a larger landscape level and begin to get people to look at the connections of watersheds, connectivity, and cumulative impacts, not just from the little parcel surrounding 250 feet notice level, but to the larger levels. Because at this point in time, at least in Los Angeles County, we're so built out that if we don't do that, we're going to lose valuable things. So fortunately, we have a bunch of tools that were already developed and ready to go. Lyle and Safford in 1997 developed an oak revegetation strategy, and they did a very interesting evaluation of where you could reconnect oak woodlands. And what I think is really important to note here is here's the Santa Monica Mountains, this is Santa Clarita, this is the San Gabriel foothills over here, and this is the San Fernando Valley, which is very heavily developed. But if you look, there are actually places all through here with potential for reconnection, and that's one of the things that we really wanted to make sure that got evaluated during the planning process. So what we did was we created an oak woodland potential map. And our goal was to have this be the map that when the developer or landowner came to the counter in the planning department, the planner would pull this map up and they would look and see if the parcel was located in one of these potential oak woodland areas. And if it was, then there was a whole level of questions that would be asked in addition to the initial study questionnaire that would really focus on what kinds of impacts there might be if this development proposal went forward. So it would start, the oak woodland and resource evaluation would start at the get-go. We decided that single-family homes that weren't requiring a discretionary permit would be exempted, and that we really wanted to encourage designs that worked with the landscape and that looked at the whole picture and tried to make it work. As with the other examples, the idea of on-site replacement was really considered a problem, and that was, you know, if you didn't have enough room for the trees that were already there, how are you going to have enough room to plant 10 more after you finish developing? So as with other places, we're recommending a 2-to-1 ratio. So the final goal that is now part of the LA County General Plan is that oak woodlands are preserved and restored so that they're conserved in perpetuity with no loss of oak woodlands. So with that, I'd like to end by saying that it's a really hard thing to plan and integrate any kind of natural resources. But we're lucky with oak woodlands because people really care about them. And if we can make these connections, then our hope is that 100 years from now, there will be more oaks than there are today. Thanks so much.
Well, perfect. Thanks so much, Rosie. A lot of good information there. And once again, the links that all the speakers have provided, and a few of you have sent in questions about each week. So